I apologize. There's a lot going on in this house tonight. All right, thank you. So good evening, everybody. I am Baroness Genefe. Well, if you want to be German about it, I am Baron Genefe Wolfelin, the Baroness of Starbuck, but I usually go by Genefe. And my email is there on the bottom. If you have any questions for me or something comes up afterwards, please feel free to email me. I have a handout that was promised that Runa is going to put a link in the chat to access that handout. And it's an annotated list of resources. There are books, there are websites, there are videos. It's some of them I am going to be referencing, some of them I won't, but all of them are really great resources if you're interested in 16th century German clothing, either in the early 16th century or some of them for the late 16th century. Because I'm focusing on the Triumphal Procession of Maximilian I, most of my resources are going to be targeted like 1625, I'm sorry, 1525. So they're going to tend to be a little bit earlier, but if you do later period and you take a look at that list, there's going to be stuff there for you also. Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. All right, so the objective of this class is going to provide an overview of early 16th century German clothing based on the images from the Triumph of Maximilian I. Special focus is going to be given to both a lower class look and an upper class look. And the slide presentation will not be shared, but the presentation is being recorded. And of course, you have that annotated list of resources that if you want to open that and kind of look through that as I go, you're welcome to do that, okay? All right, so I'm a little ahead of myself. Okay, all right, so let's start at the beginning. What is the Triumph of Maximilian? So the Triumph of Maximilian is a series of 137 woodcuts that were commissioned by Emperor Maximilian I near the end of his reign. He was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, so this is a lot of German-speaking areas, a little bit bigger than what today we call Germany. He commissioned this series of woodcuts at the end of his life as kind of a look back on his greatest accomplishments and a way to kind of get his idea of who he was and what he did to his people. There's a great quote about this from Stanley Applebaum, who put together the book that I looked at. He said that this was intended to enhance the glory of Maximilian and his Habsburg dynasty through the widest possible dissemination of inspiring words and pictures. And of course, the best way to do this in 1525 was through woodcuts because they were so easy to reproduce. So the first edition actually came out after his death, after Maximilian's death. The series of woodcuts was actually supposed to be much bigger to begin with, but when Maximilian died in 1519, it was incomplete. So what was completed was published in 1526, and then again in 1777, 1796, and then the fourth edition was 1883 to 1884, and that is the reproductions that I looked at. That is the woodcuts that Dover put together in this book in 1964. So this is what I'm working on. This is the 83 to 84 edition. It's really easy actually to get your hands on your own copy. There's a lot of different copies of these woodcuts available through Amazon for right about $25. And so you could get your very own. The main artist here was a man named Hans Birkmeyer. He was a leading painter and draughtsman of Augsburg. There's some speculation that Albrecht Dürer had some hand in some of this as well, but mostly these woodcuts are done by Birkmeyer, who was an amazing artist. Are there any questions about the Triumph itself? Okay. So it does show a triumphal procession. This is like a callback to ancient Rome. When the Romans would conquer new territory, they would bring people or exotic animals back to Rome, and they'd have a massive parade to show how amazing they were. And that's what these images are supposed to convey. It's basically a parade of vignettes of the highlights of Maximilian's reign. All right. Let's talk about the clothes, though, because that's what we're here for tonight. When we look at clothing in general in the 16th century in Germany, we're looking at basically three types of fabric. It's either plant-based, silk-based, or wool-based. So our plant-based fabrics are Ziechen or Zeug. This is linen, hemp, nettlecloth, linen, cotton blends. We're mostly going to see these used for lining or for clothing of the lower classes. Next is Zaiden. These are silk fabrics. These are all imported at the time. Heavier silks, velvet, satins, damasks, lighter silks like taffeta, and then of course brocades with metallic gold or silver thread. And last but not least, we have wool. So two basic types of wool that we see mentioned at this time. The first type is called Givan. This is our more expensive wool. When you take wool from the sheep, you have curly hairs and you have longer straight hairs. Givan is woven from the curly hairs, and it's also oiled as it's woven too. So this is going to give you a better quality cloth. But we also have worsted wool. So this comes from the long straight hairs of the sheep, and this is going to give you a lighter and cheaper fabric. All of these fabrics could be blended. Wool could be mixed with linen and silk. Of course, linen could be mixed with cottons. So blends are also very period. When we look at this time, a lot of information we have about the making of clothing comes from tailor books. And one of my favorite resources is actually this book right here. It's called Der Schnittbucher, and it's 3 Austrian master tailor books of the 16th century. There's an amazing discussion at the beginning of this book about fabrics that were available at that time. In one of our tailoring manuals, tailors are expected to know off the top of their head 42 different types of fabric. So very, very extensive knowledge of materials that they're working with. But it also gives us an idea of the materials they're working with as well. So if you are interested in early 16th century fabrics, I'd really recommend this book. Like I said, the chapter on fabric is extensive and a great read. Any questions about that? All right. So let's go ahead and get started with our first look. My idea here was to go through lower class male and female and then an upper class male and female using the images from the Triumph as a guideline. So we're going to start with our lower class female. So at the very end of this triumphal procession, we see the baggage train. We see kind of our lower class servants and helpers carrying all of the things that made the rest of this baggage train possible. And one of my favorite images comes from right about page 134 to 35, and it's these 2 women right here, because I feel like they give you a very good view of the characteristics of German clothing at this time. Just starting at their heads, they are wearing a Sträuchlein and Wust, and this, I will go into more detail about this. They actually have laurel wreaths on their hats, which are allegorical, very appropriate for the triumphant, but not for everyday wear. They are wearing hemd or shirts. They're wearing Kleid or dress. They're wearing shirts or apron. And I want to say the lady on the left is wearing an apron. And even if she's not, the apron is very much a part of this outfit when we look at other woodcuts from the period. So I'm going to talk about it. And then they're wearing a little half cape called a Galler. So we're going to talk about that as well. So the first piece is their headwear, the Sträuchlein and Wust. So the Wust is the padded roll here on the right. And this is what gives their headwear that very particular shape. The Sträuchlein is the cover for the Wust. So that is the thing I have here on the left, the kind of half moon. And below it, I have images of me wearing my version of this. So this very unique head covering consists of 2 or 3 parts, depending on how you choose to wear it. Mine is 3. I have a coif, and I attach the Wust, the padded roll, to the coif, and then the Sträuchlein goes over the top. The padding or Wust is what gives the crown shape to the back of your head, and then over the Wust goes a Sträuchlein. This covering can be plain linen like mine, like the one pictured here. It can also be heavily decorated and embroidered, depending on the look you're going for. And if you want to be super fancy, you can even put a veil or schlier over the top. There's many different interpretations of this hat. This is my interpretation, and it is not the most historically accurate one, but it is the easiest to take on and off, and it is incredibly convenient if you are trying to put it on without a bunch of pins or without a mirror. It's usually you get this on your head and you're doing okay. So I chose convenience and durability and something that's easy to wash over something that is more period appropriate. If you're interested in creating your own, Mistress Genevieve von Lubeck at her website, germanrenaissance.net, which I'll be referencing quite a bit, has a step-by-step construction of a Wulstalb and Stoichlein, including a video tutorial by Mistress Sophia Kress, who in real life is Marion McNeely, who is one of the authors of Dries Schnittbucher. So both of them very, very, very much know their stuff. So a couple of different options there if you're looking to recreate it on your own. I have my pieces here. They're fairly easy shapes to create on your own, or if you'd like to go into more detail or you'd like to find out a little more about this headwear, germanrenaissance.net is a great place to start. Questions? Fabulous. All right. So next is the hemmed or shirt. This shirt, this garment is going to be pretty much the same for male or female. A typical shirt would be patterned something like what you're looking at on the left-hand side. The shaping of the shirt would come from the extensive pleating at the collar and cuffs. The shirt design seems to be very widespread, very typical of the time. We see similar designs in Italy, Germany, and England throughout the 16th century. Variations of this design include pleating the neckline and sleeves into separate collar and cuffs, into embroidered trim or woven trim, anything that looks very fancy. So the particular hem that you are looking at on the right-hand side is one that I recreated as a part of a seamstress woodcut. And her hem, because she was a seamstress, was very, very heavily pleated and worked. You can see that I had smocking around the collar. I also had smocking at certain parts on the sleeves and also on the cuff as well. But the general design, I think to most of us that recreate period clothing, that general design of that shirt is not shocking. It's pretty basic geometric shapes. Question, yes.
What's the width of the fabric?
Well, honestly, in period, fabrics are going to be not quite as wide as what we're working with, but when I reproduce this garment, I'm working with linen that's probably about 44 to 45 inches wide. That's a great question. If you are interested in pleat work, or if you're interested in smocking, or if you're interested in the decorative details that you see on the collar and cuffs, again, germanrenaissance.net, Mistress Genevieve has created a free publication that she is graciously sharing with the world. It's called the Pleat Work Book, Mastering 15th and 16th Century Pleat Work Techniques. So if you really want to dive into weeds on that one, that is another great read. And like I said, it is free. Okay, so that is the hemmed. All right, next is the Clyde or dress. All right, so looking at these two ladies, they are wearing two different styles of dresses. The style on the left is more of a front-laced bodice type dress. If you're familiar at all with German costuming, you may have heard of the Krennic dress. This is a dress that laces across the front. To me, that's what it looks like she's wearing. However, the lady on the right is wearing a much more typical design, less regionally specific. Her design is the one that I see produced the most often, and her design is the one that I've patterned, giving you the basic shapes of on the right. So the design of this garment varies with region and access to materials. I've chosen the pattern, the most common design that I've seen. You may choose to make the garment with or without sleeves, although some kind of sleeve is much more common. This dress can be made of linen or wool. Wool is a more period appropriate and more durable choice. It also tends to keep the colors a little better, so it provides more vibrant color. It's important to remember that although these dresses were decorated to a point, usually when we look at these woodcuts, women's clothing is kind of, it is secondary to men's clothing. It's not going to have as much decoration. It's not going to have as flashy colors as what some of your men might be wearing. These are my interpretations of what these pattern pieces might look like, and this is based on my own experience and observations and research in early and late period tailoring. You'll notice if you look at the bodice, a couple of things. You do have a curved front, so it's not the flat front of Elizabethan costuming. You do have a curve more like a cotardie. You'll notice that the side seam is actually underneath your arm. It's on your side. When we look at early period German clothing, we don't see that seam kind of move further back until after 1560 or so. So it's going to be a true side seam. You're going to notice the shape of the sleeves. Most of the variation we see is in the sleeve. A couple of characteristics of the sleeve, though, are not tight fitting, but tailored sleeve, ending in a pretty wide cuff. And that cuff can be worn down, as you see on the left side, or folded up, as you see on the right side. Slashing is also a part of what we see on these sleeves. And you can see the lady on the left. I have my diagram right here is kind of what I think, or how I would pattern her sleeve there, with a two-piece sleeve with an upper sleeve, slashes, lower sleeve with a guard and a generous cuff, and then lacing holes. Could you hold on one second? I apologize. Oh no. Could you just ask Amelia to shut her door, please? So that is the Clyde or dress. Now I'm not going to show this pattern again. You're going to see when we move into the upper class dress as well, that the silhouette or the shape is going to stay pretty much the same. You're going to see variations in the sleeves. You're going to see variations in the materials, but the basic shape and silhouette should look very familiar. Are there any questions about the Clyde? Thank you, Bruno.
I have a question. Were the sleeves detachable at all, or are they always attached to the bodice?
That's a wonderful question. So I have done this both ways. I have done sleeves that attach at the shoulder, very Italian influenced. And then I have done sleeves that are set into the bodice. I have to say, when I take a really good hard look at woodcuts and I look across many artists and I look across a couple of sources, I don't see a ton of evidence for a joining at the shoulder as much as I see for a joining at the elbow, like the lady on the left there with her upper sleeve and lower sleeve. So I would say, based on my observations, if you want to make the most period piece possible, your sleeve is going to be set into your bodice and attached at the shoulder. And if you do have another piece of it, that divide is going to come at the elbow. That's a great question. Any other questions? Okay, wonderful.
Talk about fake poofs.
Talk about fake poofs. Fake poofs. Okay. Well, so fake poofs, I'm going to say, I think that this is sewing, instead of wearing a full hem underneath, sewing the linen to the top and bottom sleeve. So you're just creating one garment when you put it on. Is that what we mean by fake poofs? Yes. Okay. Yes. So that is another great kind of hack. Again, that would be like my Wulstab and like my Wulsten Streitsline. That is a great way to approach this style in a way that is more convenient, in a way that is easier to wear, in a way that is harder to lose. So that is definitely one way to do this. However, in period, I believe, based on my research, that that was a shirt coming through, especially looking at this illustration right here. All right, let's talk about aprons. So the aprons were a pretty common part of women's costume at the time. Aprons are one of the most functional pieces that we usually see. They're also optional. We don't always see them, but I usually opt for one since I use it a lot. Aprons can be as intricate as the seamstress's apron shown below. So this right here is a woodcut of the seamstress, or it can be a simple piece of linen pleated or gathered into a waistband. If you're interested in creating a more intricate apron, again, Mistress Geneviva's website has several tutorials on period pleat work and drawn work, all of which can make your apron look very fancy and very pretty. And down at the right-hand side there, at the bottom right, is a recreation of the seamstress's apron that I did a couple of years ago, just kind of showing the smocking and decoration at the top. I would highly recommend an apron. It's just very practical. I like practical clothing. All right, so let's talk about gaulers. So the gauler or half cape is the piece that we see kind of over top of the Clyde, the dresses that our ladies are wearing early on. It's incredibly useful in keeping the sun off your chest or adding another layer of warmth. Like most of the garments we are discussing, the cut remains basically the same for upper and lower classes. So not a lot of difference in tailoring, more in materials. I've seen beautiful reproductions of Galler in wool with fur linings, and I've seen beautiful reproductions that are just 2 layers of linen. So the materials are up to you. This garment does go a long way though towards creating what we think of as a German look. Honestly, if you take a dress and you add a Deutschland Wurst, you give yourself a padded hat and you put a Galler on, people are going to look at you and say, oh, you're doing German. It's one of the things that really that silhouette and those shapes really kind of call us out for what we're doing. And if you're interested in a Galler pattern, so the Galler I'm wearing in the middle there, the blue one, was Mistress Amy Sparrow's Galler pattern. The one on the left was one I did myself. And then the one on the far right is a pattern from catafolk.wordpress.com. So this is the website of Catherine Allen, and she is a classically trained tailor in Sweden. And she has also graciously shared her pattern as well. So you can find that in your list of resources if you're interested in making your own. But as I said, in my eye, it really completes the look. It's just one of those little visual clues that you are doing German when you have a Galler on. Okay. So now it's time to talk about lower class men. All right, so we're going to talk about 3 major types of garments here. We're going to talk about the hem, the shirt. We're not going to go over that again. We already did. But we are going to introduce hosen or hose. And for lower class men, we're going to talk about a Rockle, which is a small or short gown. Rock, R-O-C-K, is the word that was commonly used to refer to any kind of men's gown at this point. And Rockle is going to be a small one. So hose. Joined hose, the bane of every tailor's existence. Joined hose have been a challenge for me that I have attempted a couple of times. They are, depending on who you're talking to, they are easy or difficult to get right. It's taken me a couple of years to kind of come to terms with them, but they are very important when we're doing a German look. If you are interested in recreating the look of the Landsknecht, the German mercenaries, hose are where it's at. If you're interested in doing a lower class look, hose. If you're interested in doing an upper class look, again, another version of hose. So it all comes back to this kind of standard leg covering. Variations of this garment have been a part of Eastern European fashion throughout the 16th century. This particular pattern that you're looking at on the right-hand side comes from the first book of fashion, the Books and Clothes of Matthaus and Viet Conrad Schwartz of Augsburg. This is a book that was published probably about 30 to 50 years after the triumph of Maximilian. However, the cut of the hose has not changed very much in that time. The last section of this fashion book is a reconstruction of one of the men's garments pictured in the book. The Tudor Tailor also has a great section on how to draft a pattern for period hose. When you're drafting pattern for period hose or when you're making hose, always remember to cut this garment on the bias. You want to have stretch. It has to be how did I explain this? It has to be snug enough to be tailored, but not snug enough to be an experience wearing hose. It shouldn't be an experience. But it also should give you ease of movement. You should be able to bend over. You should be able to squat down. You should be able to do all the things that you would do in a pair of pants. Materials for this garment are going to vary. I've made them out of linen and also of wool lined with linen. You can see in the illustration to the left that they are, on the left-hand side, I've given you more of the mercenary look, more of the soldier look. They are very slashed, whereas if we go back to our kind of lower class men's look, we don't see that same kind of decoration. If you do plan on slashing though, be sure to choose a material that will hold up to it. I try not to slash anything except wool because wool is going to give you, and especially like a very tightly woven or a fold wool is really going to give you the staying power and a garment that you can wear over and over again. If you try to slash linen or cotton, that you do need to finish each of those slashes on your own, and that can be exhausting. And I would also recommend creating a base foundation for this garment to help it hold its shape. So it would be a lining that would maybe go down to mid thigh, just another layer to help give it a little bit of structure. It should be a fairly structured garment. You definitely don't want to do just one layer of linen. I don't think that would provide enough coverage. or structure to give you the kind of look that we see when we look at these woodcuts. Oh, so again, as far as the keys to fitting good joint hose, cut your hose on the bias. So cut it on the diagonal of the fabric, and that gusset. So looking at the illustration on the right, the pattern piece there, the triangular piece below the cod piece where the letter A is, this is very important in the wear and fit of the hose. If the gusset is too small, if the gusset is not placed in the right place, you're going to end up ripping out to the crotch of your pants very quickly. Okay. Any questions about hosen? Okay, moving on. All right, let's talk about the rockle. So the rockle is a diminutive term meaning small or short gown. It's shorter than a rock. So just basically your small outer coat. The picture you're looking at on the right is an original taken from the Lienfelder Schnittbuch of 1590. So this was a tailoring manual that was published in 1590. So probably like 50, 60 years after the Triumph of Maximilian, but lower class clothing did not change as quickly or frequently as clothing of the upper class. So I believe that this pattern would still give you a very similar garment to what you're seeing on the left-hand side. This drawing or this image was taken from elizabethancostume.net. Mistress Drea Lead scanned many of the images from the Schnittbuchs. You're looking at original images. She has them all available on her website. You can see, looking at this coat, it's a pretty unique cut. It's one garment, one cut, which is convenient. So here are my sleeves. Here is my collar. This is going to be my back collar. My back collar kind of pops up in the back. It's cut what we call gestalt. There is probably 2 pieces of front collar that are not pictured in our cutting diagram. So those would be additional pieces that we would need to add to the front of the collar here. Here's my front closer of my jacket. And then if I look at the skirting, I can see that there are slits cut into the skirting. Both Mistress Drea Lead and Marion McNeely kind of postulate that those were perhaps gores, that there were some small gores to put in there to give it a little more body in the skirt. But a fairly basic design for a fairly basic little garment that is very serviceable and should last you a long time. All right, any questions about lower class clothing? Okay, moving on. All right, so let's talk about upper class. Let's get classy. We're going to start with the female, and I'm going to start with probably the most important woman in the whole Triumph of Maximilian, and it is this woman right here. This is Maximilian's first wife, Mary of Burgundy. They really were not married very long, but she is by far his favorite wife. He often talked of her as kind of like the epitome of what a wife should be. So when we look at the Triumph of Maximilian, she does get the most fabulous outfit, and you're looking at it right now. So the image on the left is from the Triumph. The image on the right is from a family portrait of Maximilian and Mary and their 3 children. And it was painted posthumously, so it was painted after her death. But it does give you an idea, number one, of jewelry, which is the most important part. When we look at upper class clothing, so many jewels and jewelry, it's going to be everywhere. And it is another one of those kind of visual clues that clues people into the fact that you are doing upper class German. She has a very particular type of hat that is worn in her portrait to the right and also by some of the women that we see in the Triumph. And it's a hat that I have not produced yet. It's called, I believe, a Stickelchen cap. And if you're interested in that kind of hat, German Renaissance.net, Mistress Genevieve has a possible pattern for one, and I would send you there to learn a little more about that. The hemmed or shirt is very similar as the ones we've looked at before. Again, just because we're in the upper classes now, probably a finer linen. The rock or gown, we're going to go into detail, but again, the shape is going to be very similar. The silhouette is going to be very similar. We're just going to see basically variation in the sleeve, and then of course, jewelry. So that is Mary of Burgundy. All right, so this is Mary's wedding party. One of the things that Maximilian decided to include in his triumph is his marriage to Mary. So we see him and her above this beautiful cart that's just carved with images of their wedding party. So we do get some higher class women that were part of Mary's wedding party. And when we look at their clothing, we're going to introduce a couple of new concepts, mostly in headwear. So many of them are wearing what I think is a gold haube. We'll talk about that. I see a teleberet, kind of the flatter, like the platter hat, and then a beret or a Dakin beret. They're also wearing hemmed or shirt. They're wearing rock, gown, and of course, so many jewels. So let's start with the gold haube. So gold haube just basically translate as gold hat. It is usually associated with Kranich gowns and Kranich dresses. Lucas Kranich the Elder was an artist that was working mostly out of Saxony, a particular region in the German-speaking world. And so his portraits kind of reproduce that very regionally specific dress. And this hat is a part of many of those portraits. It gives you a shape, whereas the Wulst and the Steuchlein gives you kind of a halo on the back of your head, the gold haube kind of gives you pieces on the side of your head. It's a little lower down where the excess ends up. So it's a little different silhouette. Okay. The first one I made is pictured there on the left. It was really just a basic bag and a band, very heavy Italian influences there. The one that I wear now was currently made for me by Mistress Amy Sparrow. There's a picture of me wearing it. And then here's a picture of it laying flat. If you're interested in making your own gold haube, there is both a video tutorial from Mistress Amy and also directions from Mistress Genevieve listed in the resources. I believe that Amy's tutorial walks you through it step by step. These head coverings tend to be gold in color, hence the name gold haube or gold hat, and they're often heavily decorated with elaborate embroidery or pearls. So very, very, very upper class pieces that we're looking at here. All right, let's talk about berets. So a couple of hats that I saw on the people that were not wearing crowns is, of course, that very famous platter hat. Again, we see this in many of Kranich's portraits. This is the teleberet. When I reproduce these hats, I usually make them out of wool, and usually a heavier wool, because again, these hats have a lot of slashing. I'll wash and dry the wool before I use it. And for the larger brim teleberet, if I want to make something with a very, very big brim, I might start with the brim of a straw hat to give it the interior structure and support. So normally I'll take one of those big flat straw hats and I'll cut the crown out of it. And I'll use the crown for something else, and I'll use the brim to cover to make this style hat. So I get that really big flat shape. The one beret that I have made is closer to a Dakin beret. So that is the picture that I have right here. And for this type of hat, it's also called the starfish hat. You can see the lady on the left is wearing something similar, but it has more of a structured crown, a shorter brim, and then very, very heavy slashing in the brim. So this is mine. This is the one that I wear most often. You can see it has the crown for a straw hat, gives it its base, and then the brim is just gathered and slashed wool. So my tabs are not, they don't have as much body to them as the lady on the left there, but it is a similar style hat. And then of course, feathers. And there's a picture of me wearing this hat right there. If you are interested in creating your own Dakin beret, Thimble and Plume did a great tutorial on how to do this on YouTube. There are 6 videos and a free pattern. So if you're interested in the Dakin beret, this kind of hat right here, Thimble and Plume on YouTube is a great resource. Any questions? Fabulous. Okay. All right, let's talk about the rock or upper class ladies gown. So again, we're going to use a similar terminology to what we use when we talk about men's gown. The word is rock. The upper class gown will have a similar rounded body shape as the lower class Clyde that we've already looked at. So you can see the rounded bodice. All right, you can see the straps are a little more off the shoulder when we look at this dress. That's an easy adjustment to do. But most of the variation is going to come in 3 things. First of all, we're going to be using much more expensive fabric. and we're going to be using more of it. If you look at the skirts, they are very, very full. And we are going to have more elaborate sleeves. So you can see there's a lot of variation in the sleeves of our wedding party right here. We see slashing, we see long full sleeves, because again, we're in the earlier part of the 16th century. But what I did was I picked one lady in here and kind of broke down how I might draft that sleeve. So it's not going to look terribly different from our lower class sleeves. You can see we have 2 rows of slashing now instead of 1. We still have the split at the elbow. It's still laced, the upper piece to the lower piece. And then we still have that very characteristic cuff. And I've created a similar sleeve here. This was a 12th night dress I did a couple of years ago. I know someone asked me about sleeves before and whether they tie at the shoulder. And I said, not usually. This was one example where they do. This was a woodcut of a particular lady, and her sleeves did join at the shoulder. So mine does as well. But I still have the same basic upper and lower sleeve with that beautiful cuff. And there's actually a little bit of slashing there too. So yeah, so that is a very beautiful German ladies sleeve. Any questions about that? Okay, let's talk about dudes. All right, so the male look. Again, you're gonna see some terms we've already talked about: hemmed or shirt, hosen or pants. We're going to throw a couple more in there. We're going to talk about hats. We'll talk about the Schopp, which is a very close fitting kind of cap, and Wams, which is basically a German doublet. Yes.
Genefe has Brustfleck?
Ooh, okay. Did you? Oh, okay. Are you looking at my dress? Okay. So the Brustfleck, or this chest piece here, is very common. We see this a lot in German clothing. Now, in looking at the Triumph, though, and looking at this piece that was published in 1526, you do not see a lot of that style gown. As a matter of fact, I don't remember seeing any of that style gown. Almost every gown I saw had the same front closure, came very high up, and not this kind of style. You will see more of this style later, and I do actually use that term to talk about men's clothes as we move forward. So yes, this is a very German style, but again, I don't see it in the Triumph when I look at the clothing that is a part of the Triumph. But again, like, styles are so regionally specific that I'm sure you can find evidence of something like that earlier than or at the same time as the Triumph of Maximilian. All right, let's talk about men. Okay, oh, all right. So one of the new terms we're going to introduce is Schopp, and this is a very particular type of hat. We can see it on this gentleman in the back. It reminds me very much of an arming cap. However, it is heavily decorated and slashed because German. The small slashed or unslashed hat is very specific to men. We don't see women wearing it. It's characterized by the ear and neck flaps, which you can see patterned here and assembled here. It can be worn alone, or it can be layered under a teleberet or another hat. Wool or velvet are great fabric choices for this hat. I would tend towards wool because of the amount of slashing that's usually involved. But that close fitting cap that covers your ear and neck is called a Schopp. All right. Ooh, let's talk about Wams. So Wams or doublet, okay? I pulled a couple of different images to take a look at this because just like the women's dress, there's so much variation. Many images, though, are really tricky from my standpoint to reverse engineers because they don't show you a front or back closure. Like, figuring out how these clothes actually functioned just based on the Triumph of Maximilian would be very, very tricky. I see lots of images with a solid front. I see lots of images with a solid back. I see some images with slashing and tying, but I don't see a lot of images that give me a very clear picture of how this garment actually functioned. So there was one that stood out to me. It looked very similar to something that I had reproduced in the past. So I decided to focus on this right here. So this particular set of Wams is just a couple of pieces. It's got the doublet back. I've patterned it for you down here, the back of it. And then the front is cut with a big wide open U. And then that area, this right here, is filled in by the chest covering, or Brustfleck, there's the word. And it is all laced together. So I did make a version of this for my husband. He was very happy with the way that it fit, with the way that he could move in it. And I highly recommend it, as it is probably the easiest to document because it's the easiest to reverse engineer. So, because for example, if you wanted to take a look at this gentleman here or this gentleman here, back lacing would be very unpractical. And then there's no join down the front. So the only theory I can put forward is that maybe there's some kind of side lacing. And of course, it's hard to tell because of the other characteristic of these garments, the big puffy sleeves. If you are trying to create a silhouette based on the Triumph of Maximilian, please, 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 gentlemen, big puffy sleeves. Again, that's one of those visual clues that people will look at and say, even if nothing else, they will say, oh, you're trying to do German, or you're doing German. It's just a couple of those things for women. Of course, the hat, the collar. For men, big puffy sleeves and tight pants. So if you do nothing else, do big puffy sleeves and tight pants. All right. Okay. There are a couple other higher class garments that we don't see very often people reproducing, but we see a ton in the pictorial evidence, and that is, of course, the whopping rock. So I do want to talk a little bit about that garment. That is this big kind of coat that our gentleman holding this statue is wearing. It's got larger sleeves. It's got a skirt attached to it. And it is, I'm going to use the term whopping rock, but I want to talk about it first. So if you want to be more general, you can say it's a rock. It's a type of gown. If you want to be more specific, you can say it's a whopping rock. We are going to, oh, hold on. Let me see if I give you, yeah, there it is. Okay, let's go a little more detail. But if we want to be really specific, if we want to use the term whopping rock, we need to make sure we're using it correctly. So a whopping rock is really a heraldic gown. It's going to have the colors of the house or town that you are associated with. You're going to see it at tourneys, or you're going to see it worn by servants to identify them with a certain house or town. It's very different. Well, not very different. It looks very similar to the whopping rock with an F, but a whopping rock is made specifically to be worn over armor. There are all kinds of different rocks or gowns depending on what you're doing. So if you're in a triumphal procession, you're going to wear your heraldic gown, your whopping rock. If you're going out to fight in your armor, you're going to wear your whopping rock with the F that goes over the top. You might also wear something called a pultrock, which is a very similar gown, except a pultrock is going to have a high neck. Or you might be hanging around your house wearing your liebrock, which is going to be a tightly fitted gown. Or when you're writing, you might be wearing a reitrock, which is your writing gown. So all of these garments, if you look at them very quickly, it's easy to mistake one for another. So a lot of that terminology kind of gets thrown around pretty loosely, but we are going to look at the whopping rock, which is the heraldic gown. So that's what these men are wearing because they are a part of the triumphal procession. They're either identifying themselves as a part of Maximilian's retinue or one of the lower nobility that's traveling with him. But the silhouette is basically the same. We're going to have larger sleeves, we're going to have a tighter fitting bodice, and we're going to have a pretty long skirt attached, usually just to the knee or the bottom of the knee. It's very full. You can see a ton of pleating. Your sleeves can get very fancy. You can slash your sleeves. You can make your sleeves very, very large, or like our gentleman carrying the statue, your sleeves can just be pretty plain, but still very full. Still very full. Okay. The silhouette that you're aiming for as a man at this time is lots of shoulder, very square shoulder, a smaller waist. And that's really it. You just want to, you want to have most of the bulk, most of the visual attention in your shoulders. So a lot of times if you cut things just a little bit off the shoulder, it makes your shoulder look a little bigger. That's not a bad thing. That goes kind of a long way towards giving you this silhouette. All right. Oh, okay. And then the very last garment. So later on in the Triumph, we actually get to meet Maximilian's son, Philip, and that's who you're seeing here. Philip married the Princess of Spain, who was known as Joanna the Mad, actually. And this is an illustration of that event in Maximilian's reign, because again, he wants to show his power and prestige and how his family is thriving and building. So our Philip here is wearing an overcoat. I initially, when I looked at this garment, I used the word Schaub or coat, but that turned out to be a little problematic because later on, when we look at the later 16th century, that word Schaub refers to a very specific type of coat that has a two-part sleeve, where the upper part sleeve is very full and the lower part sleeve is more fitted. So that, I don't want to use that to refer to this particular type of clothing, even though we are earlier on. I'm going to kind of reference what you may have picked up as big Italian influence in a lot of these clothes. So after Mary of Hungary died, Maximilian married a Italian named Bianca Maria Sforza, and she was from Milan. They did not get along. It was not a happy marriage. But she did bring with her to Germany a very heavy Italian influence. And there is a lot of overlap between the clothes of the later Italian Renaissance and the clothes that we see in Germany at this time. So to kind of honor that and reference that, I'm going to call this garment a German samare, which is a big Italian greatcoat. So if you do Italian Renaissance garb, if you have an interest in it, you probably picked up on a lot of similarities, but it is basically just a greatcoat. It has very full baggy sleeves. The collar folds back. It's cut in reverse. If you've never drafted that kind of garment, Die Schnittbucher, again, even though it's published much, much later, has many garments that are cut like that and have a very similar type of collar. That's where I learned how to draft a collar in reverse. But it is a beautiful garment, and it goes a long way towards showing off your wealth and status. So if you're going for a higher class look, it doesn't hurt to have a great coat. And I want to say that is the end. That is all the illustrations I have for you. If you have not yet gotten resources, if you haven't gotten the link to my books and videos and websites, please, please, please let me know. I'd love to share that with you. It's many of the things that I've already referenced. Of course, Die Schnittbucher is the first one. I also recommend, is it this one? I think it's this one, Brunner. Okay. I also have a couple of other books there of various other specific types of costume. For example, I mentioned the German mercenaries, the Landsknecht, very popular. Lots of people like doing Landsknecht clothing. The Landsknecht, of course, created by Emperor Maximilian. Tudor tailor, even though focuses on England, it's still a similar time frame, and there's a lot of overlap between the construction of those garments. And then finally, when we look at especially women's clothing, the medieval tailor's assistant, her cotehardie, her advice on drafting a cotehardie and some of the shapes that she uses are still very appropriate for women's sleeves and women's gowns as we move forward into the 16th century. Question?
We have a question on where we can find the Landsknecht in the procession. Do you know?
I do know. So the German mercenary or Landsknecht are going to be fairly early on in the procession. They're some of the first groups you see. Of course, he sends his soldiers in first, after the musicians, sorry. Musicians come first, then soldiers. So yes, there are several illustrations of Landsknecht, several different types. Men fighting with spear, men fighting with sword, men fighting with sword and shield, different types of shield. So if you get your own copy of the Triumph, you will not be disappointed. Ooh, men with halberd as well. Yes, so definitely you can see them here too. Great question. All right, and then of course, a lot of the resources that I have referenced and a couple of videos. Mistress Amy's video on the construction of a gold hop, step-by-step tutorial, awesome. And Thimble and Plume, their 6-part series on the construction of a Dock and Beret or starfish hat. And then again, if you are interested at all in later period, later 16th century German, that Wikimedia file, it gives you complete access to the Matthaus Schwarz's book of fashion. He was He was a burgher living in Augsburg in the mid 16th century. And in the middle of his life, he decided he needed a record of all his outfits. So he commissioned someone to paint him in different clothing. And he has a different page for each of his outfits. And he tells you like what he was doing at the time and how much it cost and what fabric it was made of. He was very fond of his closet. And then if you do, there is a book also that was written on this topic that I referenced earlier on. And if you get your hands on that book, it will also give you his son's book of fashion as well. So more later 16th century clothing. And I think that's all I have for this evening. I hope that was enough. Questions? Comments? Concerns?